Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. This is from the War Room to the Boardroom podcast, talking about preparing transition. I'm your host, Mason Wilson, Global Strategy Operations, go-to-market at Google, combat veteran, Duke MBA, and West Pointer. Today, we have my guest, Mr. Aditya Sunny Sundaresan. People know him as Sunny Actual. He and I will be discussing his path of transition into business school and content creation and comedy. And so Aditya is a content creator with over 4 million followers. He's the founder of Zuvier, which is an adventure travel fashion retail company. He also served as Infantry Officer and is a graduate of UC Santa Barbara and is a current student at NYU Stern. And so without further delay, Sunny Actual in the building, everybody.
Thank you very much for having me. The intro sounds way more impressive than I certainly feel. I will say one correction on the followers. I think I only have like maybe 200K across all platforms. So I don't have millions of followers yet, but I do have millions of views. So I'll take that one.
Your content's pretty good. Every time I fill it up, I'm like, man, he is like spot on. So for our listeners who don't know, who you are, tell us about, yourself, kind of where you're coming from. I think that'd be really helpful for some of our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So I go by Sunny, which is a nickname for my last name, Sundaresan. For short, it kind of became Sun, like Lieutenant Sun. And then affectionately, everyone in the Army has a nickname at some point. So it sort of became Sunny, and it was, I felt it fit or other people thought it fit my personality, which is kind of nice. I go by Sunny or, Aditya, my first name, a little harder to pronounce. But yeah, so I was an infantry officer in the Army for almost 5 years. And as soon as I got out, I started making these like comedy sketches. I've always like made videos since I was a kid. So that like skill was kind of there. And yeah, they blew up, which is how I guess I got invited here and how people know me, at least for the military stuff. But yeah, that's sort of like the short story is I went to school in Santa Barbara, no intentions of joining the Army. I mean, if you'd told me, I don't know, when I was 19, 20, you're going to be an infantry officer one day, it would have been something so inconceivable. But then as I was graduating, I didn't really like sort of where my career was going. I was studying physics, and the options to graduate with physics is you either become a professor in physics, and you got to really love physics for that, and I didn't. Or you kind of switch roles and you use your math skills to go work in finance or something like that, and or for a tech company, and that didn't really sound appealing either. So I sort of started looking into the military. I had a roommate that was in ROTC, sort of went down that path, joined the military, chose the infantry. In my mind, if I was going to join, I kind of wanted to do the most, like the most non-civilian thing I could think of. And I had no plans, like joining in terms of like where I wanted to be in my career. I was just like, this seems like an adventure. Infantry seems like it has the most, like basically the least civilian job I could do. I had a blast when I did as a platoon leader, and then as you're out as well. So every officer comes to this sort of cynical point, probably, where you're going with your career in the military doesn't really match what you want anymore. That's what happened to me, and it was sort of the inspiration for my comedy. Honestly, it was I got really annoyed at a lot of things that were happening in my unit, and so I got out, and I just made them. I didn't know who was going to watch them. I figured my friends in Alaska, I was stationed in Alaska, Fort Wainwright, figured they would watch it. And then I sort of realized that everybody across the Army had the shared experience. So, and then here I am.
Nice. And so in terms of your military exposure, so it was just your roommate, like where are you coming from in terms of hometown?
Yeah, that was part of it. That was like my first exposure just to knowing someone that was even he was in ROTC. And so I did OCS, which is after you graduate, for those that don't know. And so that was sort of my first exposure to that, the fact that life was even there. Like you'd wake up this was my freshman year before I thought about joining. You'd wake up at 5:30 every morning. I thought it was absurd. That seemed like now 5:30 really doesn't sound that early anymore. But at the time I thought that was insane. And then when I thought about switching careers, I just looked at everything, government jobs, anything that seemed like it had some sort of purpose, besides just I'm just going to get a job to get a good paycheck. At least at that time, that was my motivation, something that seemed to have some meaning. And in that search, I found there was like a common thread with a lot of the stories I was reading. It's like, oh, so-and-so is doing this thing. He started his own business, but he was in the Marine Corps before, or he was in, and so then that sort of led me down that path. And I guess you could call it kind of like a midlife crisis at like 20 years old. I was like, maybe I could, it was so outside of what I thought I was even possible I could do that I sort of was just like, well, maybe I could do this.
And so
I got zero leadership experience, like zero, I played soccer. Sorry. Like I just, for how sort of thinking back on it now, like I had zero leadership experience, at least in college, like in high school, I was in, clubs and all this, various different things. But in terms of, in college, like wasn't on a sports team, wasn't leading anything, I was just doing physics and, in Santa Barbara. So for me to go to that, to like infantry officer, sometimes in retrospect seems like kind of bizarre, but I'm glad I did it.
And so in getting out, one, I guess you explored these different career opportunities, but I guess why did you go down this very different track compared to, most military officers will go and be like, oh, I want to like go into finance or go work with a JMO headhunter and go out and do this thing that's a bit more structured. Why kind of the entrepreneurship or the content creation kind of fun piece?
Yeah. So I'm finishing up school right now. I guess I forgot to mention that. So I got out and I was in Iraq when I was thinking about getting out. I was really thinking like, I don't know exactly what I want to do. Kind of have some ideas, if you hear along the officer pipeline, okay, get your MBA. And I still have my GI Bill, which is really nice. So I decided like, okay, I can kind of procrastinate facing the real world for 2 years. So I studied for the GMAT and I got into, really thankful I got into the NYU here in New York City. And I've sort of been using the last almost 2 years now to sort of build up, my own business, this brand of comedy stuff to try to lead to opportunities to kind of run my own thing. To be honest, I had no idea what other officers were even trying to do with the MBA because I was one of the few. Alaska's so small that you really don't have any like peers who are getting out at the same time you are. So I had no idea that officers got out and wanted to do consulting and banking. Like I had no idea because no one around me was like people that had gotten out like years before I was at the unit. And I only knew one other officer who got out, who was my friend who went to law school. So I had no bias to what type of jobs junior officers were doing when they got out until I got to school and realized like, oh, I'm the only one, who has like creating like videos and everyone else is, going to work at these big companies. So I would say like, to answer your question, like it never really factored into my, like I never even knew that was an option. I never even like saw that, which might sound weird now thinking about like all the other officers' experience. But yeah, I didn't even know.
Yeah, that's cool though. I mean, to like that vacuum and then like still find this niche that, you find very fulfilling and do very well with because you have like a large following and people like really enjoy your content. Like I think every video you drop, I'm like, oh man, this is 100% spot on. I was like, I knew I wasn't crazy.
Well, I appreciate it. To be honest, like I don't know if I'm the best person to always give out advice because the reasons I do things are often, I don't think the reasons like most people, I don't know. I shouldn't say most people because I think, I don't know. It never seems to match what people around me do them for. I did physics because I always thought I was good at science when I was a kid because my dad's a scientist. I thought I wanted to be a biologist, which is what my dad is. Physics was the only class I got a B in science. So, you build this personality that, oh, I'm good at science. And then I took this AP physics class in high school and I got it's like a B plus or something, which is the first time I'd ever gotten below an A in science. And so I was like, okay, I want to study this major, I'm not just going to let this slide. And then, the Army, same thing. I chose infantry, less about the opportunities of infantry, more so that I remember when I was in basic, the drill sergeant told me like real officers, I sort of bought into that at the time. It was like, real officers go infantry. And he was like, you're probably not going to choose that. And I was sort of just like, well, screw you, man. Like I'll do what I'll do the hardest thing supposedly and be an infantry officer. And then I don't know, same thing with this content skit. I've never really like thought about I just sort of see what seems like it would be fun to do or, rewarding. And I just do that. I don't really think too much beyond that, for better or worse.
So kind of, proving the doubters wrong, if you will.
Yeah, sometimes. And just, I wouldn't say like 100% to prove anyone in particular, but just to like sometimes prove to myself, like, can I do this? And then I'll just like jump into it. I'm not super motivated I wouldn't say I'm not motivated by money. I think everyone is to some degree, but the big titles of the banks and stuff don't really, they're not really in my like radar. So
no, I think those are great points. And so along those lines, how do you feel like, whether it's your time, as an infantry officer, how do you feel like that prepared you for this life of being, a content creator, entrepreneur, given, the gray area and the ambiguity that comes along with that? That's very different than, say, being deployed in Iraq or day-to-day field operations.
Right. Yeah. I would say for anyone that's thinking about starting your own business, it does suck, like a lot. I think the best part about starting any business is right before, when none of your ideas have failed yet. And, you think you can do anything with it. And then you start it and it sucks because, your value is so low in the beginning, especially if you don't, like, I'm not investor backed or anything. And I don't want to be for a while, but it's just creating your own value is just very difficult. So it sucks. But I would say that, the infantry life, or just any officer life, probably more so. And I don't know if you're in an infantry battalion the whole time. Okay. Yeah. So just like something going wrong every day, which in a weird way, I think prepared me more than I thought, because I think none of the stuff, I've never worked in like a big corporation, but based on what I know from my friends, like none of that stuff would fly. At least a lot of the stuff probably wouldn't fly that happened in the Army. Just, every day it felt like there's some plan, which is just you come up with for the sake of saying you have a plan, and it goes wrong by like 9:30, Yeah. So I would say to that extent, what it's prepared me is just the mental aspect of like not, just falling apart when something's not going to, it's kind of corny to say, oh, it's not going to plan, but it's kind of true. I would say that's the biggest part, which is not something I think the Army intentionally tried to train, but it's a side effect of just the amount of things that just went wrong. And when you're trying to do your own thing or do content creation or anything like that, there's so many things out of your control that if you don't have some sort of ability to kind of brush it off and move on, I think you'll sort of just collapse.
I think those are great points. I echo a lot of those sentiments that, it's all fine and good on paper, but like showing up day after day after a couple no's or a few hundred no's, always the real test.
Right. Also just, there's a lot of like there's so many days in the infantry I remember, especially when I wasn't in the field. My favorite times were being in the field, or even in Iraq, like I was on a COP, which was pretty cool considering the time I was at, 2019, which by that time, like most of the COPs had been closed down. But like just being in garrison and doing paperwork stuff, there would be days I would work like 12 hours, 14 hours. I was like, I don't even know what I did today. Just like, like you're really tired and you try to like remember what you did. I would say like, when you try to do your own thing, business or whatever it is, I think you can feel like that sometimes, where you're just like doing a lot of like random things. And then you're like, I don't know what I did, but I feel tired.
Yeah. There's a lot of those. And when you talk about doing that as like a major or an 04, I was like, this doesn't sound that great. I don't know about that, guys.
Yeah. There's a point where you're doing like civilian work for Army pay. That was one of the reasons I got out, just sort of like an aside really, but I was like, I'm not going to do paperwork. That's not what I joined, So I was sort of like, this is dumb. Now, I also want to like point out with my content that I think right when I got out, I was a little bit salty. Now, I suppose if you don't know me in real life, the assumption could be that I'm waking up, because I'll have comments on this sometimes, just like, dude can't get over his, I don't know, whatever. His kind of, it's like, I don't, like, guys, I don't wake up and I'm like, I'm in New York City, you know what I mean? Like, I don't wake up and I'm like, my freaking BC, like, I'm still mad about that, but I will remember, because I have a following and people do enjoy it. And I like creating stuff that people enjoy. That's sort of a core thread of like anything, whether it's entrepreneurship or whatever. It's just like coming up with an idea and other people enjoy it. But no, I'm not still, waking up like angry about, like, I just think it's funny. Nor do I hate West Point either. I just think from a tactical point of view, I made one video kind of lightheartedly, and a lot of West Point people took it really seriously. And I kind of got a kick out of their assumption that I'm thinking about it really seriously.
As opposed to just running everything else. Yeah.
As opposed to just like some lighthearted jokes. I mean, I couldn't care less about really any. At the end of the day, like everyone I met, officer, were either crappy people before they went to their commissioning source or good people before. And, I don't think their commissioning source really had much of an effect on that. But anyway, that's to clear that up, which is really, I don't know if anyone really thinks that, but sometimes I get comments on that.
No, definitely great clarity. And so from that, when you left, what were you trying to like optimize or solve for? You mentioned like you were searching for mission in like various places in like government or like other sectors. And so
right.
Like, what was that driving factor? Be like, I need to hang up the uniform and like, hey, this is a way that I can still find meaning in what I do next.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I never been asked that before. So my like family, like at least on my father's side, they're all like government. Like my dad works, he's funded by the state in terms of his like science research. My grandfather worked for the government of India, so on and so forth. So I think just growing up, the assumption that you're doing something for some sort of service reason, even if it's a selfish reason, like I want titles or whatever, it was kind of always there. So I, doing physics to a little bit of an ego thing, but partly it's like, maybe one day I can discover something, until I realized I wasn't smart enough to do that. But with the Army, I think, the war. So when I joined 2016, I was still searching for something like important. And ISIS was really big in 2016 because the 82nd was in Mosul at that time. But yeah, 2016. And like big operations in Syria and stuff. So I'd see that in the news. And I was like, the idea of even being part of that seemed really cool. Yeah. So then I went through the Army, and being a platoon leader was pretty amazing when I got to do the things that, platoon leader is supposed to do. Totally matched, probably even more than I could have dreamed of doing. I mean, even being in Iraq with how little deployments were going on in 2019, like that was still pretty epic to me, even though it wasn't Mosul 2005 or anything crazy like that. Just for my expectations coming in, it wildly blew that out of the water. And just, you're basically like a kid, like playing in the woods for your job when you get to do it, which is pretty epic, I mean, but then, you get to a point where you're only given like 1 to 2 years as a platoon leader. I'm not sure what it is in artillery, where you're really with the guys. And that's the best part, that sort of in between world where you're still doing some thinking, planning, which is, interesting to do, but you're kind of still with the guys, and you really only get, 2 years like that in the infantry world. And then unless you go to special forces or Ranger Regiment, and even then it's only just still another year or two. And then you're kind of done forever, like you then become a company commander, staff, whatever. And I was like, I don't like, I don't want to do paperwork as my job. And just the bureaucracy of everything really turned me off. Like, I think there's a lot of good officers in the high ranks. I'm not like that sort of cynical, but got to the point where it seemed more about like what looks good on paper. And I was just like, I don't want to be doing this like full time and not also be like walking around in the woods and stuff, because that was the part that actually made this enjoyable. So then I was like, screw this, I'm going to get out. And yeah, part of the motivation for content creation and like entrepreneurship and stuff is to be able to kind of try to do the things I actually want to do, which is, being able to go outside, film things, basically come up with ideas in my head and actually execute on them, and, hopefully sometimes make money from them. It's definitely very difficult, but yeah, being motivated by an aspect of like, okay, is this like fulfilling to me? And then also, can I like, is someone else going to benefit from this? Those are sort of my two, or at least I try to go to those two things.
That's helpful, right? To see your journey and kind of some of those things that you're thinking about in soul searching. In your transition process, did you leverage any kind of programs or resources, right? You go through the, TAP or SFL or whatever
Yeah.
these days? Were there any things that you use beyond that to kind of really get your in the whole situation?
No, zero. I so my timeline went like this. I was in Iraq 2019 to 2020. Towards I'd say the middle of my deployment, things started heating up between Iran. So my deployment, they shot like this missile at us, which there's no KIA or anything, but pretty big deal for like an established country to shoot something. And IDF started picking up, and we thought they spun up 80-second GRF, and I was like, all right, things are about to go down. And then all of a sudden COVID happened. And I think it hit Iran pretty hard. And everything stopped after that. It was like cease operations, and suddenly became super quiet, but we were stuck in Iraq for like another 5 months after that. So there was a lot of time to think. And so, that was the point where we were literally just, nothing was going on. Nothing was going to go on. And we were sort of extended there. And so I studied for the GMAT when I was there, and I was sort of just focused that whole year on just getting into a good MBA program. And so my transition out was really short. I got into the school and I basically had 4 months to sort of put everything together when I got my refrat approved and clearing papers and everything. So I didn't really look up any transition programs or do anything, which was probably not maybe the smartest thing to do, but I just wanted to get out of there so bad. I was like, what's funny now is that certain people that run some of those programs have reached out to me to try to advertise or promote their service, which I believe in, because I sort of wish I knew about it. But again, nobody from my sort of cohort, peers, were getting out. People that were getting out were all gone. So I know, I wish I had. So I just used TAP and sort of just trusted that, I don't know, it would work out.
No, that's helpful, right? So I guess in looking back, is there anything else that you would have done a little differently in looking at your transition?
Man, I wish I'd done I forget what it's called. I want to say it's called the CSP, Career Skills Program, I think is what it's called. But basically you can kind of use your last 6 months or sometimes even a year. I'm not sure how long it is, but basically you can get paid still by the Army, but you can be in literally a civilian business or organization, and you can literally do that before you get out. And I kind of wish I had known about that, because that would have been way more preferable to being stuck in Alaska while I was trying to clear. So I think that's the big one, because there's no downside to that. You're still getting paid by the Army, and you're literally getting civilian experience. The biggest fear about getting out, if you don't have an MBA or something, is, what am I going to do? That really would have helped with that, I think.
Great points. And then lastly, where do you think you're trying to go? So you mentioned, you're still building, your retail adventure business, you're still producing content. If you were to look let's say 3 to 5 years down the road, where do you want those to go? Or do you see yourself, hey, I've done this venture and now I'm going into, movie production? Where do you see yourself going?
Yeah, I'm not honestly sure, because even this whole content thing, I couldn't have predicted, at least in my mind, big it's gotten, at least big within, maybe this niche. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. My ultimate goal is to be able to do the things that I find rewarding to work on and actually get paid to do them full time. I'm not quite there yet, but that's ultimately the goal. So I think because my life has already so far changed in ways that I didn't even, going from physics to the Army to making videos on, TikTok or Instagram Reels. I couldn't have predicted that. So I don't really have anything set in stone that I have to be in this place or be working on this thing. But I think as long as, at least 50% of what I'm working on is something that I actually really enjoy and I'm getting paid to do it, and I can live off of that full time, I can pay bills, I could, 3 to 5 years from now, maybe start a family off of all of that. That would be pretty amazing. So that's my number one goal, is to be able to scale this to a point where I can actually really be full time. I'm not really sure what I want to do with the military stuff. So I've been out in June. It'll be 2 years that I'm out. So I got out 2021, and so 2 years out. I was in almost 5 years. I kind of have this rule. I don't know if I'll stick to it, but my sort of rule for myself was no more military stuff longer, like, no more than 4.5 years out. So, I don't want to be talking about it longer, longer than I've been in. I'm not sure. I mean, it's got a pretty cool following, I think, and people really enjoy the videos. I have no idea what I want to do, with that. I really like creating videos. I really like doing comedy stuff. I think it's a lot of fun, but I'm not sure where that's going to go at all. So I asked myself the same question.
Well, at least cool that you're open to the opportunities and, at least you're enjoying much more where you're at. That also being said, were there any things that you either listened to, whether it's books or podcasts, to either help you with the transition process or to know that business school was the right avenue, or, converting your thoughts and writing down scripts, anything that kind of helped you in that journey of entrepreneurship?
Sure. So yeah, I guess to kind of talk about, I'll just sum up my business. What I really want to sort of have succeed is this brand called Zuvier, which I kind of originally tried to target towards veterans, but that didn't necessarily have to be. I kind of messed up there a little bit, where it's not really a veteran brand, but it's sort of the reason why I'm doing it, if that makes sense. But I mean, it was sort of inspired by my time in Alaska, where, I'm from Sacramento. I sort of grew up with like city hip hop type of culture. And, I was stuck now in Alaska for 3 years, where the only thing to do is to hunt caribou and, catch like pike. And it wasn't how I grew up, but I sort of started to embrace that. Cause I was like, the other alternative is to drink at you talk about military towns being kind of sad and, podunk, like you see the Alaska town, it's like, there's one bar, I'm not literally, but there's, one of like 3 bars, and there's no like nearby city where, like with any other military base, it's like, okay, you got the military town, and then, okay, drive 2 hours away. The only place to drive to is Anchorage, which is 6 hours, sometimes 8 hours in the winter, like through the mountains. And that's it. Everything else in between is like, it's nothing. So, I was like, I have to embrace this outdoor stuff. And it started to become kind of fun, because we sort of put we kind of added everyone that did a lot of that outdoor stuff kind of took it really seriously. And I thought it was a lot more fun to kind of do that, but kind of have like this, I don't know, we call it like irreverent vibe about it, which I think kind of comes from like the skate, surf, culture. So trying to integrate that into like what's more traditionally seen as like very gritty adventures, like going out doing backpacking the snow or riding on snow machines. And the concept was to kind of do media stuff around that. And right now it's a blend of like graphic t-shirts and like apparel that you can do when you're, on various like adventures and things like that. And then also doing media for companies that actually do those things. You can kind of call it like an extreme adventure / apparel. So that's what I really want to focus on. In the beginning, there were so many things that I thought the MBA. So one of the reasons I wanted to do the MBA was I thought it would help kind of focus my interest in this business and really help me with it. And I didn't really know the MBA was mostly for sort of transitioning into different corporate jobs. I really didn't know that. I thought it would be more about, okay, everyone here is probably going to try to start their own thing, and I'm going to learn some industry secrets about starting your own business. And I don't think I've learned too much from the MBA on that front. And I've learned more from YouTube, and I can't think of books off the top of my head, but I think I've learned more from books and honestly YouTube videos kind of about how to do your own business more so than the MBA. I think that's been the most helpful. I don't know if that would help anyone out there, because it's really hard to figure out which YouTube videos you can trust and which ones you can't. But it's a combination of sort of screwing up, referencing videos, seeing if someone has done the same thing, and then reiterating. And it's a big part of this whole thing is kind of your mindset on it. Even with content creation, the idea has to be you're not I'm not passing up my skits to a boss, not passing up my clothing or my anything to somebody else to look at and approve. Whereas I would have done that in the Army, and it sounds kind of simple and corny, but it is kind of like a mindset shift. You kind of have to trust yourself, because there's nobody to tell you but you whether your skit's any good. Sometimes you can produce something that is good and it flops, and it's really hard to tell whether it flopped because the skit was actually bad, or because it just, I don't know, the timing was off. Maybe the joke was too nuanced for the audience. Like I have skits that I've reposted that do really well now because the audience is big enough to know, like, oh, this is a type of joke that, like, I understand it's a brand of humor now. Whereas in the beginning, they were a little bit like no one understood them. So I don't know if I answered your question. I don't think I did quite well, but that's sort of my thought process behind all of this. It's like I learned a little bit from my MBA. I think one of the best things I've done is because you're asking about books, right? Like what books are? I think the best book that I've read, or at least I've never like read a book and then like automatically like my life is better the next day. But the books that I think are really good are the ones that kind of confirm things that were sort of floating around in the back of my head. Like, I'm not sure why it is this way. And then I read the book and it's like, oh, it makes so much sense now. Someone's actually thought this out. So the best one I've read is called Deep Work. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. I think it's by Cal Newport. It's a really good book because the way I was able to even think about doing my business, even knowing what I was going to do after the army. I mean, I also came up with ideas with my comedy stuff in Iraq. I would like write it out kind of as a joke. The reason I did that was like we built this mortar bunker and our shifts were like 6 hours. My phone had broken earlier that deployment and I just didn't think to get like a new phone. So I was literally there for, 5 to 6 hours with nothing to do. My guys were like watching movies and stuff. And I had some notebooks and some books. I would just like start writing things that were in my head. And I think if I had my phone or movies to watch, I would have been too distracted to even concentrate sorry about that noise.
No worries.
I think I would have been too distracted to concentrate for, it's so annoying. It's like, I don't know if you've lived in NYC apartments, but the delivery people will just hit every apartment like buzzer to try to just get in. It's like, I'm not going to let you in. I don't know you. So annoying.
That's hilarious.
So this book, Deep Work, it kind of confirmed what I'd done in Iraq, which is I didn't have my phone and I didn't have a reason to have the phone. Because I mean, literally the way they got a hold of me was, radio, or they were just physically nearby my command. For the first time, I think probably in my life, I've really like focused on, and I was also studying for the GMAT. And I mean, the options were to study for the GMAT or like watch some crappy show that, or mindless show that, maybe one of the soldiers are watching. And so you're kind of just like forced to just be there. And studying for the GMAT honestly started to become like less boring than just sitting there. This book, Deep Work, just talks about how like to come up with really good ideas, you should really block out like 4 hours of time or a few hours of time where you're just not doing anything but that thing. And it's amazing how often, like, especially in civilian life, your attention is so fragmented by like random things like text messages, emails, that like you can't even like focus on something for more than 30 minutes at a time, which makes it very difficult to come up with good ideas. If I scheduled in like, 25 minutes of like, all right, business strategy thinking for Zuvier, like I'm going to accomplish nothing because I'm just going to be like, kind of stressed out for 25 minutes. But if I'm just sitting there for 3 hours and like really like thinking through, not looking at my phone or anything, I tend to find that you can actually get a lot done. So I think that's probably, it sort of confirmed what like inadvertently had happened in Iraq, where I had this like unbothered block of time. But I think it's like probably the most important thing that I try to do in my time. Like I'm not going to come up with good comedy skits if I just try to do it in 20 minutes, so I really do them in like a few hours. I haven't made one in a while, but partly for that reason. But I just try to set aside like 3 hours because it takes kind of like 30 minutes just to sort of like get your mind going sometimes. And then the next 2 hours I'll come up with like 20 ideas and then I'll just make them. So yeah, that book's probably the best one I've read.
You talked about switching mentalities and then also kind of eliminating some of those distractions. And so can you talk a little bit more about how you do that? So given, we're not deployed anymore, there are so many more distractions. You're talking about you're being in New York City, one of the busiest cities on earth at all times of the day and night.
Yeah, like that.
How do you still carve out that time to really focus and get that deep work in? given there's so many competing priorities?
Yeah, it's pretty tough. And I certainly lost a lot of all that discipline I just talked about, being super badass, studying for the GMAT or whatever. I'd lost the second I came to New York City. I wouldn't say I lost, but I certainly let it go. Cause I was stuck in Alaska for 3 years, in the Army training for another almost 2 years, IBOL, that whole thing. And, I turned 21. So I wasn't 21 in college. I turned 21 right when I graduated. So I never really, and then I joined, basic training, OCS. So I never really gone out as an adult before. And Alaska doesn't really count. You go on trips to Vegas or whatever, but that doesn't really count. I've never lived in a place before and been old enough to really actually have a real nightlife, as crazy as that sounds. And so as soon as I came to New York for 6 months, pretty much you're in school and all of a sudden, you can make an infinite amount of friends if you want to, especially here, and do an infinite amount of things. And it was certainly pretty hard in the beginning. That's about when I found the book, actually. I think it was recommended by one of my professors. And it's pretty hard because, especially when everything is through your phone or email, what happens, I think, is you assume that you're kind of missing out on something. If you block out 3 to 4 hours of time, there's a sense of well, maybe some email has come in or some text message, or, I don't know, for me, it's just check, website or check social media, check my messages. And there's no purpose to any of that. And all that does is kind of fragment your mind. The only solution is kind of be pretty brutal with what's actually a priority or not. You can't respond to, depending on what you want to prioritize that day or week. You can't, you shouldn't reply to every text the second you get them necessarily, or involve, user dependent, depending on your job or whatever, but you have to be kind of ruthless. Easier said than done. I'm still kind of sometimes figuring out what that is, but it's kind of ruthless with what is actually important or not. Because otherwise, you're never going to get 3 hours of free time ever. But I do think most people can have that time. You just kind of need to ruthlessly cut out something that's really not that important. And that can kind of sting at first.
Oh, those are amazing nuggets. That also being said, you talked about switching mentalities. How do you get comfortable in, hey, I don't have a boss? Do you go about developing a team, or is it kind of you in your own headspace, really thinking about this idea? Do you have friends that you kind of bounce those ideas off of? How did you go about that piece of it?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I've never been asked this before. I've been on a few transition things that never really asked me about, I don't know, my headspace. Very interesting. Yeah, solo entrepreneurship, I think, is very, very difficult for that reason, because there's nobody to kind of check you on whether what you're saying is crazy or actually doable. There's not necessarily a great solution to that, because you will have to put out some stuff that afterwards you're man, that sucked. And in the beginning, I certainly bounced it off of friends. I actually think friends can be pretty, if they're not anytime you create a business, or even with your podcast, you're also in the same, degree entrepreneur. Anyone who produces anything that, outside of the sort of strict rules. And if your friends aren't your target audience, it's very dangerous to ask them for advice. And that's kind of what I did at the beginning. I knew my brand was a little bit out there, kind of cocky, has a little bit of this irreverent look to it. And, I was asking friends who would never have bought the product I sort of envisioned in my head for their advice, because that's who's around you. So you're going to ask them. And, they give you feedback that is really well-meaning, but it's just going to throw you off the path a little bit. And I think mindset-wise, being your own boss, it's very difficult, because you have to trust yourself, kind of like I said earlier, which is very different from coming from the Army, where you're allowed to trust yourself on some decisions, but some other things you kind of get to let somebody else deal with that. Above my pay grade, right? You get to say nothing's above your pay grade when you're running your own thing. It's all your pay grade. You don't get to throw anything under somebody else's bus. It's just you running it. And that's a pretty tough thing. You kind of have to believe that you're capable of doing stuff, which is not an easy thing. I think if you're working at, say, a 9 to 5, depending on your job, often you're done after 5 o'clock. You're like, whatever is happening wrong with the company after 5, it doesn't matter. It's not my problem, right? It's like, well, when you're doing your own thing, it can like keep you up at night because you're like, I don't know if it's going to be okay tomorrow, So I think part of building that is just to get some wins, and to try to reduce. So like anytime you have an idea and you're wondering whether it'll work, I think if you can reduce the time it takes for that idea to like be tested, then I think that's the best thing to sort of build confidence, because the worst thing you can do is kind of be in a state where you're thinking about putting certain things out, and you're not sure which one's going to work. And you just kind of have to put some stuff out. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And then you start to trust yourself a little bit. Like, all right, I'm going to do this next time. Yeah, it's not easy. And I'm not sure I have it like completely nailed down, It's also really hard, like if your friends are not doing what you're doing, because they'll be like, well, why can't you hang out at this time? It's like, I have to work at that time. Nobody's telling me to, but if I don't force myself to do this at a certain time, nobody's going to fire me, but otherwise like nothing will get done. And that's a really like tough thing to sort of adapt to, if that makes sense. You're on the podcast. I don't know if you feel the same way at all.
Oh, absolutely. Right. It's my job to hunt down guests, find topics, ask good questions, actually look at people's background. Because if I do the same questions and it's not relevant to my audience or, their unique journey, then like, what am I talking about over here?
Right. And it's something that you chose to do, which is a pretty tough thing. And sometimes I think you can feel like a slave to, like sometimes in my comedy, especially since it got bigger, people were requesting certain videos, or even, I got ad deals, which is really cool. I'm so grateful for anyone that watches my stuff that I even got the viewership such that a big company would come and reach out to me to do a brand. But sometimes I get, people reaching out that kind of just want like favors, and you never want to turn anyone down. And then you start to feel like a slave to the very thing that was supposed to be fun. It's like, man, I got to respond to this person, or I have to post this video, and it just requires a certain level of just being your own boss. It's just tough. And there's no like easy way to do it. You just kind of have to take a few, I think after you take a few losses, it becomes really easy actually. Cause then it's just like, well, all right, I didn't die. Nothing really bad happened. And then after that, I think it gets easier.
So a combination between building those muscles to developing that new mentality, really being good about those boundaries in terms of like blocking off that time for deep work, and then also the asks and things that you get from yourself or from other people. If I got that about right.
Yeah, I would agree.
And then kind of last part, really talking about your transition out of the military, but into this, entrepreneurial space, content creation. If you had to do it all over again, is there anything that you would change? That could be planning. We talked about timeline. We talked about location out of Alaska is a little challenging.
Yeah.
What about like, benefits or terminal assignment? Is there anything else that you would have changed about your experience?
So I wouldn't have changed anything about my military experience. I think being stationed in Alaska was really epic. I got to do things that at the time I was stationed there, I hated it until I that's sort of the inspiration for the brand, which was to sort of embrace like, as this, city person, embrace this like epic place. So I have no regrets there on the military thing at all, even though the MBA was not totally what I was expecting. I have learned a lot about things that I think aren't as useful to my classmates, actually, in a weird reverse way, which is that's like a kind of a separate point. But I think some of the classes are actually very useful for what I'm actually doing like right now. So I don't regret even doing the MBA. I think the biggest thing that I wish I would have known in the beginning, and honestly, it's not really so much as a regret because you don't know what you don't know. But I wish someone had told me this, is I really wish I would have spent more time validating. So, I'd spent money up front on clothes and various, things for the website, et cetera, et cetera. I wish I'd sort of sold first and then built later. I think that expression is sometimes used in places, but basically instead of like building anything and then seeing if people want it, you just this is for anyone that's trying to do anything business related who hasn't done it before. It's probably obvious to anyone who has built a business, but I think if you can sell something first where you're just seeing if someone would even want it, and that doesn't mean like asking your friends. It means like trying to build like the most, skeleton thing you can, and just seeing if someone will put their credit card and buy, even if you have nothing like to actually really sell them. You can just be like, oh, sorry, we're out of stock, or I don't know, whatever it is. Just testing that first before just building the product and hoping people buy it, because then you can kind of get humbled pretty fast when you realize that you're the only person that cares about this and no one else wants to pay for it. So I think that's the only thing I would have changed. In terms of the comedy stuff, I had no predictions on any of that. So it's far exceeded anything I ever could have thought. I think I wish I hadn't gotten so attached to the comments in the beginning. I suppose that's pretty natural. Now someone can post 1,000 hate comments a day. It doesn't bother me. But in the beginning, it did. And I'd waste way too much mental energy in a day, like trying to think of a funny response that made it look like I really didn't care, but was kind of annoying. And that was just massive waste of time in the beginning. So I think those are the only two things I would have changed. Everything else, I learned kind of as I went. So
yeah, could you talk a little about some of those classes? And then in terms of not internalizing the comments, I mean, these are like your babies, right? Like your thought ideas, like
right.
heart soul to a degree, right? Like how do you work on detaching yourself from it, but still be invested?
Yeah. So a quick point on the classes, I think there's actually classes are trashed by a lot of my classmates. So like, oh, I'm not going to need this at my job. And I guess like I could agree. Like probably at their job, they're not going to directly graduate and use something in their classes. But, I have no business background before this. I've never worked in a civilian company before. So like a big one. So I actually think a lot of the classes are helpful to the extent that, could I learn the same things on YouTube? Probably. But it's really nice to have the professor who's working with businesses in real time or real life kind of say like, yeah, I consider this important to learn. If that makes sense. So, you can find finance stuff on YouTube, but you can just get so lost in like, is this really what they use in Wall Street, or is this really how they, and in the classes, even in the classes, that's probably not how they do it in Wall Street either, but at least it's a more of a sort of just, you're sort of closer to the source. And I think that's, I'm learning a lot that I would have never, like, I'm never going to sit down one day and teach myself finance for fun, So I think that is something that is really helpful. And even if I'm not doing that job, I think it's really useful to know kind of the language of how the businesses speak, and whether or not you like how finance is done, or you like how consulting or all these things are done. I think it's still very important, even as an entrepreneur, to understand like how they're kind of speaking to each other. So that's a note on classes. I think that's been really helpful. In terms of like hate comments, I think I heard I forgot what creator it was, and it was something that really helped, where he was just kind of like, anyone that says, oh, you shouldn't get affected by hate comments like at all, ever, is like lying. Like you're a human being. Like it's impossible not to get, somewhat affected. But he says that, once you build enough like views or whatever, you should have enough confidence in yourself. And he also says like, after a certain point, if you're not having hate comments, it means you're not reaching new people. And that is something that I've found like kind of true now, which is that if I'm posting videos and they're sort of getting the same types of comments, often it's because the videos aren't reaching people they've never reached before. And without fail, anytime I make a video that sort of exceeds my follower count, there's always like some negative comments. Yeah. In the beginning, I think what annoyed me was that they would just be wrong about certain things, or just say something that was just dumb. I sort of had a desire to be like, well, that's just not true. And then at a certain point, you kind of just have to, I don't know. I guess you get enough comments that you sort of get used to it. You have to be pretty confident with what you're putting out, I think, to not get affected by it. So I think where you can get affected by hate comments is if you're putting out something that you're not sure about yourself. So if I put out something that I'm like, man, I'm not really sure if this is actually that funny, like in the beginning, for example, and I get a hate comment, it can kind of be like, oh man, like maybe it's not funny because I wasn't sure either. It's kind of like, I don't know, showing something to your friends, right? If you're not sure either and your friends roast it, you're kind of be like, yeah, they're right. But if you're very confident about it, like, I know this is funny, I have friends that think this is funny, and you truly believe that it is funny or that it is entertaining or whatever, and someone talks shit about it, can I swear on this? Sorry. Someone says something negative about it, it shouldn't bother you, because you should be confident with the fact that, like, I know this is funny, and you're always going to reach. I mean, you also have to think at some point, like, who's commenting on social media? Like, I've never, I've scrolled by videos before and been like, okay, that's kind of dumb. But I've never like sat there and been like, I'm going to type a message to them. So when I started thinking that way, I was like, I think the last time I've ever commented was in high school when YouTube was really big. That was because I was a kid and I had like nothing better to do with my life, than I never commented like hate stuff on YouTube, but I'll comment like, I wonder what, I don't know. I can't remember what I commented. Maybe it was middle school, but I think that was the last time I've ever commented on anything. So it's just like, you got to think at some point, like, who is like, what kind of like loser is like taking the time out of his day to like actually comment something negative. And then, in your head, you just got to go like, don't you have better things to do? So then kind of makes that better.
No, it's a good points about, not internalizing it and kind of doubting your vision. I think that's super helpful. The last piece, you've really given a lot of good like insights to like how to.
I hope so. I don't know, sort of things from my brain. I hope they're helpful to somebody. They're more like, I feel like a lot of my advice is like, don't do this rather than, do a certain thing. But yeah, I hope it's helpful to somebody.
I mean, those gyms always work too, right? Like, remember like your best NCOs, they'd be like, hey, so-and-so, like, I know we're about to go on deployment and it sounds like a good idea, but don't do it.
Yeah. And then they do it anyway.
Every time, like clockwork. I think last piece, anything else that you would impart to veterans that kind of want to fall behind you? You gave some really good nuggets about, kind of diving into that uncertainty, really blocking off some time and approaching it with discipline. Anything else that comes to mind? And if not, that's cool too.
Yeah, I guess I'll say like a final thing about content creation, maybe. And that could be with business or anything that's like where it's your idea and you're putting it out in the world and you're hoping people will like it. I could go for a product or videos or whatever. Yeah, I would just say there's no good time to start ever. You can waste a lot of time like thinking about better ways to do something. And, in the beginning, my skits, I mean, I've always thought everything I put out was funny when I put it out, but I can certainly look back and be like, oh, I could have, tightened up the comedy a little bit better. And there's no real good, perfect time to really start, I think, anything. I don't know how it was for your podcast. You just sort of sent it one day, but I think a lot of people, they're hoping for, the stars, the moon, the galaxy has to line up in order for some sign. Their boss has to tell them, I'm going to give you this job that will give you just enough time to work on your side business or work on video. Like, just not going to happen. And, it sucks whenever you put anything out for the first time. It just does. And it kills your ego, because until you put it out, you can believe that you're really good at it. And then, you put out a video and, it gets like 100 views. So yeah, I think that's my biggest advice. Just start. Your friends will roast you. Don't take it like personally, like, oh, you're making videos. Then you hit a point where, you're successful enough that all of a sudden it's like legitimate that you do whatever it is you're doing. So I think that's my biggest thing I can say with confidence to anyone out there.
No,
I want to do this.
Just start somewhere, anywhere, anytime. Last note, if our listeners kind of want to follow you, they're not already, any recommendations on how to catch up with you, whether it's social media or things that you're working on, books, companies, initiatives, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate the free plug. So Sunny_actual, that's my military comedy stuff, both on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, I think, as well. And then I also have my brand, which is somewhat related in the sense that, if you're a veteran who likes adventure and sort of irreverent apparel a little bit, it would fit, but it's not like a over-the-top veteran brand. It's Zuvier Lifestyle, Zuvier, made up word, ZuvierLifestyle.com. And then that's pretty much it. If you're a fan, feel free to DM me. I try to respond to people as best as I can. I never thought so many people would message me in the first place. So yeah, that's how you can reach me. And if you have messaged me before and I haven't answered, it's just, I can't answer everyone's comments. But I do appreciate anyone that does already follow me and shares my videos. It means a lot.
Definitely. Well, we appreciate it. Sunny Ashwa, everybody, Aditya. We appreciate your time and thanks for your listening.
I appreciate it.